Okay, I think we may have put our little old logo back onto there. It's tricky sometimes with some of these little windows. I'm an old person. What the hell do I know? Let me also file up and bring to mind our patrons, which is a different window that we need to screen share. Come on. There we go. Ta-da, hopefully. Thank you very much, everybody who has continued to hold the fort on the old RJ's supply stream so that I can keep doing this every single week and working on all of our exciting little books. We are at least on a much more reliable internet connection, which speeds things up enormously at both ends, both in terms of the presentation. Admittedly, I'm not razzle-dazzle in the way my co-author Jackson is with his well-constructed videos with all the cute little editing and all of that that's going on, or Apologia or Erica or any of these others. I've decided, yeah, I'm too busy working on the research, so I can funnel the research to you, and you can make of it what you will, even if I'm not as photogenic and as sophisticated. Plus, I don't have to worry about buying the more elaborate editing systems and all of that, which I'm running on a bargain basement approach, and it works for me for the purposes to which I want to deal with it. So anyway, as you know, we're going through Jeanson's traced book. Technically, we are arriving at the end of the book, except not, because there's actually a huge bunch of appendices that occupy an enormous amount of space, and I'm hoping that that's where the rest of his sources are going to show up, because he certainly hasn't hit a lot of them now, and in fact, curiously, hasn't hit some of them in this final section. He dangles some papers on the Q haplotype, which he brings up in relation to the Maya with a paper from Sochtig in 2015, and I'll be putting the links up to that because that's open access. And then an older 2008 paper from Malhi, which he brings up in relation to the Navajo, implying that this thing is popping around in the genes of people in the Americas. Fine and dandy. Well, Malhi's paper was actually on the Athapskan language family of North America, which is largely up in the northern part by Beringia, but it has some little groups popping up down in the southwest, which is where Navajo and that group comes in. So this is suggesting all sorts of interesting migrations have been going on. However, it has that paper has some really great maps on the frequency of the main languages for the Q, R, and C haplogroups. And the gradients show an attenuation of C as you move from Beringia. And the R group has a gradient centered by Hudson's Bay. And Q is very much from Mesoamerica moving outward. So clearly we're looking at population distributions that have been going on. And how long does that take to happen? All in the post-flood framework? Even Jeanson doesn't seem to get too pointy on alluding to stuff where he brings up dates. Although the paper here was kind of a safe bet, because I think he picked it up because, as I found a quote in it, a relatively recent long distance and rapid population movement from the Subarctic to the southwest of North America, with the language splits being after 700 Common Era, which puts that nicely away from the big slosh and maybe comfortably, sort of, kind of, in that framework where all the Native Americans have come over here quite recently. Now this, I would therefore list Malhi as a paper that he hasn't directly misinterpreted, which is a whopping 6 out of the 22 that he's cited so far. 15 of them, as you've seen from previous weeks, he's stepped over data and all the rest. He steps back off the data when it goes to the Sochtig paper, because first of all, it wasn't about the Q group. Q kind of popped up peripherally. It was about a completely different one. It was focusing on the A branch, and that determined that the most recent common ancestor for that was, drum roll please, 9,900 years ago, which is, as you know, before the creation of the universe in his model. A2W1, quote, its oldest subclade at 9300. And then the A2W3, considerably younger, at only 3,500 years ago, which would be about 1500 BCE. That's the only one that would actually fall within the post-flood framework. So he's got a dynamic here where he's got two different things going on, and it's part of it is straddling the time frame that he wants, and a big chunk of it doesn't. And I'm trying to get rid of a little thing that's just popped. There you go. The clade containing two Guatemalan sequences, A2W1, is about 7,900 years ago, which is 5,900 BCE, which is, of course, before the creation of the universe again. So Jeanson, of course, mentioned absolutely none of that. And I'm going to have to keep that little A branch in mind in case he brings it up later, because technically we're at the end of the book. So unless he name drops it somewhere down the road in those appendices, he just dropped it all completely. Things got even more fun as we continued on, because when I was researching this stuff, I discovered that Jeanson actually has a paper by Zagura, 2004, which I'll be putting the link to, in his references, but he hasn't cited it yet. And it explicitly is discussing the Q, and it has it originating 17,000 or more years ago. Why wouldn't he bring that up in the section where he's bringing up the Q? Would seem odd. It gets even more curious as we move on about why he brought up the 2008 Malhi paper, because there was a later paper by Dulick in 2012 on exactly the same issue, which I'll be putting a link up to that because that's in PNAS. And curiously enough, some of Dulick's other work from that very same year is in his references, but he hasn't cited that either. Anyway, the Dulick 2012 that I'm referring to puts the Q group in a block originating in that 17,000 to 22,000 years ago frame. So here we're in a terrible mess. Part two of our little show has to do with a posting that Ron Neller and Taz Walker put up quite recently from creation.com. It's just a cute little thing. It's not very long either. Literally only 2 pages to put. See, what I do with documents, I put them into doc files, and that way I can save them and keep track of the URL and all that stuff. That's the entire post. It's not exactly spectacular. And it was about the Carnian Pluvial event. Now, I'm not unfamiliar with geology, but this one I hadn't actually heard of. And when I started researching it, I found out kind of why, because although it's been knocking around the little sub-basement of geology for quite some time, it hadn't popped up in things that I was dealing with rather obviously. And it's really only in the last 5 years or so that things have kind of kicked into high gear off in the technical paper category. But as it turns out, a whole bunch of stuff linked up with things that I was aware of when I went to the point of researching it, which I couldn't do with this because they don't cite diddly squat in it. Anyway, they're just talking about, of course, that what they frame it as is that there was lots of rain in the Carnian Pluvial event in the Triassic, and they deny that it is hundreds of millions of years old. And they call it a fictitious invention based on a speculative interpretation of certain geological rock layers, details of which they don't go into. And of course, they don't like the 237 to 227 million year old time range and so forth and so on. And he mentions a little bit, about the people who came up with the part of the idea, Michael Sims and that back in the 1980s and so forth and so on. So you get kind of a tweaky little bit. But what we don't get in this is a detailed explanation of what the hell they think happened beyond it just being flood. Here we're clearly discussing the issue of what the pre-flood world was like, because this would be the material that would reflect the pre-flood environment, and it's getting dumped down in the big slosh. What was the arrangement of the continents back then? Where was next to what? No idea whatsoever. However, if you start looking at the technical literature, holy smokes, does this have a lot of fun. it's quite a burgeoning field, and there's I'll be putting in a link to a general work, the first workshop on the Carnian Pluvial episode, which is from 2018. So as I said, this is where really things are starting to kick in, and the authors of this discussion are an awful lot of people that are writing an awful lot of the technical papers that we'll be getting to in a moment. One of the authors there as well is also Michael J. Benton, who is big mammal paleontologist primarily over in Britain. And that gives it a gravitas right there the moment we realize he's in the game. Ironically, a paper had been right in my reference base because I keep track of Science Advances and Nature's bunch and the material from PNAS and all of that every week. And one of the papers that I had glommed onto that I thought was kind of interesting was a Triassic crown squamate, which I'll be putting a link into there. Let me see. White side. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm not putting a white side in. I'll stick it up in here. It's available in open access, so you'll be able to locate this little puppy because it has quite a detailed breakdown of the various critters that are coming along during this little period. And that's quite coincidentally, as I was seeing this material from the creationists, lo and behold, when I was looking at this paper for my references, I realized, holy smokes, right there in the abstract, it's talking about the Carnian Pluvial episode. Bingo! So this was a work on the enormous amount of evolutionary appearances that are some of which are taking place before the episodes, some of which are developing afterwards, and then the issue of were the dinosaurs getting a leg up because of the transformation after this Carnian Pluvial episode, and what exactly was going on, and so forth and so on. So that led to a whole pileup of material on whether or not mercury deposition could be used as a feature, and what kind of fossil material was going on besides all of that, the various animal forms. And so I will be linking to Mazahari Yohari 2021 from Nature, which is open access on the mercury deposition issue, which they go into why that's important. Shellnut 2021, linking Rangelia terrain to the Galapagos hotspot. That's where I bumped into a name that I was really familiar with, because the discussion of the formation of the Pacific Northwest, if you listen to Nick Zentner's stuff, and if you aren't, why not? Because he's absolutely wonderful. His geological courses down there at Central Washington University are televised, and his summertime lectures and things are Nick on the Rocks and all that. They're absolutely magnificent. And he's like a who's who of the geological community, because we're ground zero for the most spectacular geological material on the planet. Anyway, Rangelia is a geological terrain, big volcanic, massive, think volcanic hotspot like Hawaii, but on a big scale, that was existing back in this period. And there's a whole bunch. Let me see whether I got, here we go. One of the papers, the Shellnut one that I'll be linking to, is linking the Rangelia flood to the Galapagos hotspot. It has some beautiful little background maps that we'll be plugging in. And Rangelia is hovering out there in the Pacific Ocean. And there's still issues about exactly where and how it's shifting along. And it's eventually, bits and pieces of it are slamming into Pacific Northwest and getting folded up into particularly Rangelia Island up in British Columbia. So even though it's down pretty much on the equator during the Triassic, it is rearranged and it's up in the Pacific Northwest now, what's left of it. And so all of this is all part of the issue now about how much a volcanic hotspot putting out CO2 and altering the climate that way is contributing to this very humid spurt that's taking place in the pluvial episode. No, it's not the flood coming down. It's much more interesting than that. And so all of these papers on the paleoclimate matter And there's one on the Triassic bivalves there from Stanley in 2013 that I'll be putting up as a link. And for some good measure, flora from later on, because Cretaceous mosses from that Vancouver, BC island are differing notably from extant ones, Shelton 2015. So we've got a complex mixture of working out the geology, the paleogeography, the little critters, and evolutionary appearances and time frame, all of which would have to be in order to make that part of the big slosh. And why don't we see any whales during this period? Why aren't we seeing bits and pieces of nice, cute flowering magnolias or on the land parts, along with these other things? In other words, why are we seeing the distribution that we are? And how could any geological phenomenon be so parsingly selective? And how are they accommodating all the data field that leads to the recognition that Wrangellia at the time that it was formed wasn't in British Columbia, it was in a different geographical area. So even in principle, the flood geology model would not negate magnetic field reversals and orientation of the magnetic field and all that. They, in principle, they kind of accept all of that, except it has to go and get scrunched. But how much, trying to squish that much events into too quick of a time frame is exactly as preposterous as trying to crunch the Astor Mansion and the Waldorf Astoria and the Empire State Building, all of which occupy exactly the same site on Fifth Avenue, all into the same time frame. You're going to run into problems because you're going to have circumstances. I've mentioned this analogy before because I really love the vision of it, that they're in exactly the same spot as trying to argue that Caroline Astor and her supporters in the cultural community amongst the rich would be very nonplussed trying to maneuver around all the people trying to reserve rooms at the Waldorf Astoria. And then all of them are really flummoxed when suddenly debris from the B-24 that slammed into the Empire State Building in 1945 is raining outside and causing a problem. That's the difficulty of trying to have too much happening all at once. And the posting at CMI is so vacuous. All of just that sliver of technical papers that I'm putting up, take a look at them, download them if you're of a geology mind. Colton, if you're going to watch this, I think you'll probably love all the geology that's in those various papers, as well as the paleontology aspect. And just compare that with the cloud of air that's taking place in the creationist point of view. That if you have a model that you contend is so spectacularly successful at explaining the past, then it behooves you to spectacularly explain the past, not just go, oh, flood. That's why I've taken to derogatorily calling it the big slosh in the rocks were there. And that's how I'm referring to it from now on. It's that it's a catch-all explanation that doesn't explain anything. And I think from their framework, they think it does. They can't even settle on what the damn pre-flood world looked like. Blocks of creationists think it was Pangea, and yet blocks of creationists also have hijacked Rodinia instead. And which is clearly the case, that what they're doing is they're hitchhiking the regular geology. It wasn't creationists that worked out any of this stuff. It was the regular geological community. They're the ones that worked out that there was a paleo supercontinent occurring at the time of the Triassic, the Permian and into the Triassic, and that it was gradually breaking up during the rest of the Mesozoic and finally reaching the point where we are now. The Triassic, in fact, had a lot of bumpy stuff, including a mass extinction, because there was also the camp, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, that was pushing the two halves of this Laurasia thing apart and eventually forming the Atlantic Ocean. And a little teeny sliver of what's on the edge of that mid-Atlantic ridge is above water. It's called Iceland. And as you may know, it's still kind of tectonically active. Meanwhile, this Wrangellia stuff is hinting at some of the complex activities that's going on. There's another one, Silesia, that is a terrain feature, and they've got lots and lots of material that's been pointing up. We have the ghost pieces of that that Nick Zentner has been alluding to so much in his discussions there at Central Washington University. A big chunk of that whole material we're hoping to put into the rocks we're there, because it's just absolutely magnificent. And it also is a reminder of how the creationists have been so mind-bogglingly lazy when it comes to looking at my own Pacific Northwest. Apart from some glancing references to the Missoula floods, which they can't allow to be more than one flood, and some glancing references, Woodmarapp and Ord put out a silly little piece trying to claim that the Columbia basalt was actually formed underwater. No, not during the flood. Sorry, that's not going to work. And we've alluded to that material before in the various works and all of that. But the geology just keeps piping up, and now we're into a completely new era where they're doing seismic reconstructions of the crumply zones that have the subduction things in past times that have literally crumpled together to look like, as Nick Zentner described it, and it's exactly correct, those little squiggly, hard, swirly Christmas candies that you find in some Christmas candy mix. That's exactly what they look like. And they're the clumps of what happens when you have a subduction, and the subduction starts going crumple, crumple, crumple down here in the bottom. And the continents continue to move over them. So the material that is reflecting subduction zones that were taking place 200 or 300 million years ago are now, they stayed put, but the continents are moving, and they're now underneath New York because the North American plate has rotated and continued to shift, now moving westward. It's still uncertain if you play the tape forward as to what's going to happen, whether or not the movement into the Pacific is going to kind of slow down, whether the Atlantic will continue to grow or not. So it's uncertain to try to extrapolate what kind of supercontinent might form, although it looks like supercontinents form on roughly a 500 or 600 million year cycle as the stuff clumps together and then separates. So we're clearly, interesting things are going on very, 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 very deep in the planet. But trying to take even the Rodinia supercontinent stuff on and having all of that taking place within a few years before or after the flood means all of that energy that's involved in throwing up mountains and all the rest has to happen all at once, which brings us back to the dreaded heat problem, where all of that stuff, the asteroid impacts, the sheer formation of limestone, which gives off a certain amount of energy, try to compress the miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of limestone into a particular environment, all happening all at once means you got yet more heat. And that's even without all the accelerated radioactive decay that some creationists have to resort to in order to accommodate the physical record of what happens with the radioactive record. So you add up the numbers and you got 10 to an awful lot of stuff to where you could melt the planet several times over. And as I've heard it described, it was Adam Toast. And then one that Dapper Dino came up with, and I liked it so much, I've got to put it in the new book, that the planet would be going all Alderaan from Star Wars. And that's yet another example of it. And the upper echelon geeks at the various creationist organizations are entirely aware of this as a problem, and occasionally have to appeal to just fiat miracles to respond to it, or some magical thing where somehow or other heat is dissipating into the cold, expanding universe. But then you face the opposite problem, is that the universe is so absolutely gigantic and would be expanding so quickly that it would suck the heat out so fast that it would freeze everything. So they're caught in an absolutely messy mess that they're never going to be able to get out to, but it certainly is fun for geeks like me to see them try to do it. So that brings us a little bit up to speed on things. I've been doing some additional sidebar research, plugging in material that's going to be in future episodes of this show, as well as stuff that's relating to the various book chapters that I've been doing and the various appendices. That's going to be quite a good field, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get it in with a size no more bulky than that, because that was literally at the outer limit of what you could print up through Amazon. So we'll see. You'll notice I'm wearing a shirt there tonight because it is a pleasantly cooler than it's been for the last few days. We're kind of roller coastering along, but we have kind of a cool entry into summer, which is fine and dandy and not at all unusual for this type of year. In the old days, back in the 80s and 90s, it was not at all uncommon for it to rain on the 4th of July. I'd noticed historically up until the 90s on, it was usually safer to have better weather on Bastille Day in the middle of July than in early July. But in the last few decades, the tendency has been for it to be comparatively dry here on the 4th. So we'll see whether or not that continues on this year as our whiplashy currents keep on pumping Arctic air down in here and rearranging stuff and making a very unsettled 21st century. But anyway, so long as we're not getting tornadoes and floods and super duper wildfires like certain areas and the like, and if we can avoid earthquakes and a few other things, we'll be muddling along pretty well and avoiding volcanic eruptions. We don't want that Yellowstone to go. So let me try another thing here. Let me open up my cute little, let's see what I got here. Close that off. I'm going to try to put up my little advert for the book. Let me yet another. I got to hit that. Okay. Now let's see if we can manage this again. Problem, I got to switch back. I've never been terribly comfortable with the control mechanisms on a laptop. I'm handier with a mouse than I am with a little thingy. I can do all the material, but it's very easy for me to hit the wrong button too many times. Okay, we'll share that thought, and then let's go with that. I'm exceedingly proud of the rocks were there. I'm going to be just as proud of Volume 2 and any subsequent works that I deal with Jackson. I think we bring out the best of each other in our analytical skills and all that. And we're also just having a hell of a lot of fun with it all. Just when you think there seems to be no limit to how lame creationists can be in their arguments, wait till you see the stuff they have on dragons and dinosaurs and soft tissue and all the rest. It's just a tendentious mess. And yet further examples of things where direct manipulation of source material. There's some section on dendrochronology where, yeah, we expect Kent Hovind to have his head up his ass. That's not a problem. That's kind of expected. But Andrew Snelling really does one of his blatant examples of misrepresentation of a source so precisely wrong that either he's an idiot or he's a liar. I can't see any alternative to it. It's too tactically precise in misrepresenting a source that I can't believe he doesn't know how to read a X and Y axis on a chart. So it's an interesting little tidbit that pops along in there. And therefore, all of the ups and downs that we have with Snelling, holy moly. Anyway, it keeps people like me busy little beavers. So everybody take care. Watch out for troubles if you are. And there's some of my supporters and things are in Europe. And so there's all sorts of material where Ukraine and places where things can get really mucky are involved. So everybody stay safe, except no wooden penguins unless you have properly vetted them. I never do. So we'll all see you all next week. We got a good half hour in there. The signal is running smoothly. Once it's finalized, of course, I'll be sticking all the cute little links in there because that material on the Carnian Pluvial episode, it will be just a cornucopia of stuff. And you can follow up on the other side research that's mentioned in it, and you'll learn about Rangelia and all the cute little stuff that was going on 200 million years ago in a Triassic that doesn't make diddly squat sense in the flood. So see you all next